You guys ask questions?
Yeah, we can ask questions. Will we start? Yeah.
It's very hard for me not to ask this question. You will be familiar with my question. In the lecture, you emphasize again and again the no need for aesthetics, no composition, no, and one can follow you. You are very convincing. One can see that also each building you show today, from Caltech to Caltra, Cooper Union, every building you show us today, they all look very different. So, it's easy to follow your argument and agree with. But, maybe it's not about composition. Maybe it's not about an aesthetic consideration as an overall thing, as a one thing, because it's, as you just said, it always works in 4 or 5 different ways, and it's much more complex. But then, do we need a good eye?
What?
Do we need a good eye as architects?
Well, here, right? Yes. What I didn't say is that you can probably focus on territories that don't include your own intuitive forces, because those require nourishment, but can go unspoken, of course. It's funny, I've taught since I was 26 years old. I started teaching a year before I started Morphosis, and actually Sterling comes in here again. Fairly early on, I realized that he was a curious person to like, because he had just about no facility, none. And he was like the Chirico in that sense. He couldn't paint. And the Chirico just wanted to be Titian, which was a bit of a problem later in his life. And when he hooked up with Creer, is Sterling even still a character? Do you even study these guys, or am I talking to myself, or are you just talking to?
No.
Is he somebody that you look at all? Very serious architect, major. I don't know. But anyway, when he hooked up with Creer and started doing his quasi-classical stuff, he needed to be Lutyens, and he had no talent. What we call talent, facility, and it was absurd. The work was it was not interesting work, right? But I realized that was extremely interesting. That talent is only one facility, let's say. Is only one of the elements that goes in architecture. And I immediately, that was useful to me teaching, because I realized I had very different characters in front of me, and they definitely had majorly different wiring. And it allowed me to work with people very different ways. And then you can work with different logics with different students. And I always thought of Sterling and the success of Sterling. And finally, it became clear to me that Leicester, especially these 3 buildings, Leicester, Cambridge, Oxford, were precisely interesting because they are so clumsy and so odd and so strange. Because Oxford is just the funniest. I remember the first time I saw it, it was this kind of startling, this kind of thing tipping back with props and stairs kind of punching out, and just it's rude and kind of nasty, really. And of course, that's who he was too. He loved that. He was the original bad boy, right? I mean, he was, well, he wasn't the original one, but he was one of a line of them. But anyway, your question, it'd be kind of a waste of time to talk about the intuitive stuff. That if I have whatever facility I have, it's just on board and it comes through in the work. And that's why I mentioned, I said, okay, I know the words aren't totally accurate because there's composition that automatically comes out of the work that just comes out of my own eye or whatever. But that's not what I'm interested in. That's not what's driving me. That's just there for the taking.
Sure, but I'm not looking for the singular thing. I think what is very important. I mean, for me, the overall message is that is completely not there. That is completely, Then, for me, it's a kind of, in a way, hard to really accept looking at your work, because if I look at each of your building, if you look at your enthusiasm with a vertical space through each of the buildings, and it becomes, with the bigger buildings, even more current and important and interesting and fascinating, then there's something that you take as lots of opportunities on the way that you.
But let me ask you, the facade at Cooper, the line that comes out is the line of the space inside above the ceiling that's just projected out on the facade.
I didn't talk about that line.
You read it 2-dimensionally, and then you understand it, like I talked about Eugene.
No, but for me, that's less important. For me, what is important is that for that argument is that if we're looking at the major social space where all the students go ups and down, the vertical space is a very, very important, crucial space in the building, and it's in the courthouse. We have the vertical spaces in between the circular kind of arranged organizations, and if we look at the Caltran building, we have the skin peeling off, and it's this huge vertical movement. So there is something that comes from your own individuality and from your own eye that, beyond all the other things that obviously you look for randomness and chance work, and it's very important for you, and it's kind of convincing, but kind of to erase any other, connection to this other element, which is kind of more personal. I think it's, for me, it's almost like a dangerous moment in architecture, because it's actually
The erasing of that personal?
Yeah, and I think it's in the digital times where architecture becomes more and more digital, it's kind of more and more aspect that is emphasized. So that's why I think, if I look at the overall truth of kind of the way you work and the way you work and the work at the end, one can read the buildings. We can't kind of say that they're not. I think we have to find new vocabulary to actually name this kind of things that relates to eye and personality and individuality and the idiosyncratic stuff. But maybe it needs different vocabulary, but not to say that it's kind of completely not there.
I'm totally aware of that. When the last building, I, at this moment of time, think it's the best thing I've ever done. And I've done certain things that I've never allowed myself to do in my whole career. A lot of the shapes that came out of there were just referenced. Some of them got moved around a little bit and worked with a bit. And I went, oh, this is kind of weird, because some of them are really kind of odd, the shapes of them. And I looked at it and I said, well, this is really interesting, because am I strong enough to remove myself from the work and commit myself to a process? Because what I think I've really done, that I'm happy with, is I think I produced some new typology. It's neither building or ground. And I think this is the first time. The school was still too much building, it's too typological, and it also had connective tissue that didn't belong to it, and I was still had 1 foot in the typology school and 1 foot in the morphology school. And this one is more or less pure morphology. And I think I've kind of invented something, that it's neither fish nor fowl. It's not building or ground. It's this mid-level thing. And I'm going to stay with it for a while, because I know where I want to take this next. But, and I mentioned that several times in the lecture, I might never do it, because I might never get a job that allows me to do it. The first thing I showed you, the ground form, was 25 years before that. So I waited 25 years to get this one, to get a real job, right? That I could use these ideas. So it takes a huge amount of serendipity to actually produce work that you're interested in conceptually, right? And so for me, this is a real opportunity to do something, because I could have done something else, obviously, because it was an idea that had been rattling around forever. But going back to the compositional thing, this is just one building. You can now look at it and decide, is this notion of, is it too passive? But see, I don't think it's passive, because I am completely in control and conscious, let's say, that this is taking place. Now, whether you agree with it or not, different story. But again, I'm more interested at the moment. I'm 65 years old, and I'm looking at the shelf life of my creative output, and how not to get caught up in language, because you realize you're going to die in language. That's when architecture ends, right? So you have to deal in first principles, and you have to be asking questions, because once you start repeating, once you enter the problem with language, you're now you're ending you're at the tail end of your career, because you've already now presumed that there are not questions that precede language, right? That in fact reform it, reshape it, transform it, right? And I'm trying to find some way to do that. And it's, to me, I feel freed. Instead of being responsible, that I, Thom Mayne, have to draw lines and have to figure this out. No, I collectively, I'm working with 8 people in that job. And my 2 youngest, they weren't even designers. The 2 people I had here were 2 young people that were not even on the design route, and we just got busy and just, you do it. and I'm talking back and forth, and they're moving stuff, and we're all kind of working together. And you're guiding chance in a way. I think it's really, you read Paul Auster? Anybody? I don't know who you're reading, but I'm a huge Paul Auster guy, and he used to use that for his literature for 20 years, and he's interested in the same territory of how do you manipulate, right? This space between chance and fate, right? And I mean, there's a million writers that are, this is nothing new. This is a 20th century kind of set of problems, right? And but see, I see it the other way, that I'm stuck, and that I'm looking for ways out, because if I continue the same language, I don't want a morphosis building. I want something that's not a morphosis building. And I'm willing to grow, and you can only grow incrementally. I'm not gonna make any leaps, and because I don't have anything to offer at that level. I have no huge kind of ideas that are gonna change architecture. But no, but then the discussion is, are you getting more out of the coincidental occurrences that as you are working creative with the process that's generating the work. Don't a lot of you already work that way? Isn't that part of the, because I said autogenerative has been around. I was trying to think, gee, I was teaching in St. Louis. That was in the middle of the 80s, the end of the 80s. And we were picking up wads of paper out of trash cans. We were dropping stuff. That whole, right? It seemed like that was an era, and it was, at that time it was Calvino and it's Borges, and Borges, they arranged books by color. The whole notion of challenging organization, right? And it was very much part of the milieu 20 years ago. And then urbanistically, see, there's another discussion. As the projects get larger, now I think it's hopeless. A single person or a single team can't preconceive. I'm going to say you can't do it. You don't have. Keister says you can operate 7 things simultaneously in your brain, and that's the smartest ones, right? 7 pieces of it, not enough, right? We can manipulate 100. You can, with computation, right? And as the projects get larger, I couldn't imagine composing. And I don't like to talk about other architects, but we could do that. It can't get bigger. Both would be the classic. A house, a big house, a bigger house. And we could all name our favorites. But the problem, it became evident years ago. Rossi was in the same position. It was strategic. It didn't have a strategy to go from one scale to another, right? And the increasing the scale of thing, it has nothing to do with anything. It's like his museum in San Francisco. It's this weird, big, static. It should have been a residence, but it's strategy. And so part of it is identifying what kind of problems you're interested in, and the types of strategies that are useful to solving those problems. If you use trigonometry or calculus, you use them for certain types of problems, and you made some discussion that they're appropriate method for tackling a certain type of problem. And I think architecture is the same. And we're a little bit limited. I don't think we're very good at it. And we were just talking earlier, you guys, this generation, the problems that are going to be interesting problems and the problems that you're going to make a living at, if you want to work as an architect, are going to be infrastructural, large-scale urban projects. They're not going to be decorating buildings. Less and less needed. They're going to be, we're right around, we have to be around the corner, right? Because we're looking at urban accumulations that are reaching positions of non-sustainability. And somebody is going to end up be you. The guy was interviewing me. We were just discussing if architects should be working on urban problems. I'm going, well, who else could do it? Because again, you're able to look at it analytically, quantitatively, within rational terms, and you can work on it with more intuitive terms, qualitatively, spatially, organizationally. And finally, it's the combination. Because today, they've separated radically the planners, which are policy people, and architects. So by the time you get there, it's done. The rules have been set. And do they make sense humanistically, in spatial organizational terms? They have no idea. They're just laws, right? because the two aren't connected, and it's a problem, right?
I'm wondering if some of these comments are suggesting an answer about why you teach and what you teach. I'm curious if for you it becomes an activity that lets you mine some of these topics or interests outside of the work of the office and the studio. Your point that it takes a quarter century maybe for them to be realized in material form. Just say something briefly about the kind of problems that you pose your students and what they work on and what you get out of it.
I like giving problems that I don't know the answers of, and I myself am not competent in to start with. It's funny, I've been doing urban projects now for 6 years, and tackling big problems, and have developed mechanisms for dealing with some of those problems that I'm still on. I'm going to go back to it. I took a break this time, and I did a combinatorial form, which goes back to what I was last project, working purely formally, with no. I was at Cornell, a very pragmatic school, good school, a very disciplined school, and no program, no site. And the students said it was not possible. You couldn't make architecture without program or site. And I was going, excuse me. But I thought architecture started with a program and a desire that precedes any reality, which of course it does, right? Nothing to do with, absolutely nothing to do with program and nothing to do with location. It starts with broad ideas that operate at a conceptual level, right? And so I'm kind of doing that because I'm trying to tune up, and I'm teaching with one of my designers. I'm getting all Maya people from LA and the States. And it just drives me crazy. They're all singular guys. They're all single system guys. And use Maya here, some of you, because what you're getting is you're getting a complexity of a single system. And I'm interested in multiple systems, and the complexity comes out of Boolean operations, which I know is an old-fashioned kind of beginning, but I'm convinced that there's plenty of room in that. But the key is the Boolean. The key is multiple systems that have capability of solving different types of problems, thin things, broad things, low things, right? The spatial differentiation, and when I'm not only is everybody working in Maya, which makes it there's enough people doing that. I don't have to do that. There's a jillion people doing it, but it's all single system, and it's dependent on the complexity of a single system, and it's more connected to biology than ecology. It finally makes a plant or animal, but it doesn't make a system of things that work together, because then you would demand multiple systems. You couldn't do it. And you know Hernan? Does he come here? Hernan Diaz-Alonso? Because he was just in a competition. We talk all the time. And he'll show a project, and you cannot differentiate a freeway, a building, a street, or a car. And it's okay. But I'm like going, well, it's okay for you, but not okay for me. And but because they in fact are interesting. Forget it. Forget the pragmatic part of it. That's not, we all know that. They all have different generative possibilities as they transform into something else, right? And they all have radically different performances, right? And if they're similar, well, that'll come out of an investigation of their specificity, right? And anyway, it's going to be something much more. Again, I'm going to be interested in the idea of multiple systems making complex organisms versus singular. So it's going to start from a broad kind of idea investigation.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hello. My question is about generative design. From the beginning of the lecture, you mentioned something very interesting, which is the notion of misreading. The misreading. And it's somehow kind of inherent in your project with the interest in multiple system, overlapping of multiple system to deal with pragmatic problem of program. You know, the intention of avoid clarity and randomness, and somehow there's certain kind of incomplete dimension in your project as well. So there's a very strong statement about using the kind of blurring, overlapping to avoid the misreading, or let's say mistranslation of an individual as a designer and the reality, the real program, let's say, or the collective of the program. But what do you think about the mistranslation of generative design?
Mistranslation of what?
Of generative design, or the mistranslation of this kind of scientific approach to architecture?
Misreading is a really hard one to put a handle on. All readings are based, they're cultural individual cultural products that have to do with your own set of associations, knowledges, accessibility to a particular phenomena, event, something, right? And so
But there's
if you're
it's never
interested
be
in structure, there was this really interesting show years ago on Green Street Museum in New York on the radical musical coming out of the 20s through, and there were the notations of characters. And I could look at them and see them as architectural notations because I'm looking at them organizationally, but with different criterion than sound shapes. And yet the connection is absolutely valid because they're shaping sound and I'm shaping space, or I'm shaping solids or things that have mass. And in fact, there's a huge correlation between the two, right? I've worked with projects with Thelonious Monk and Miles Davis and used their notational systems and their notions of interactive processes of instruments and their aharmonal kind of ideas, which absolutely are comparable to an architectural diagram looking at the same kind of aspects. And they're right because they're shaping, and they're interconnected sound shapes versus form shapes, and there's a huge kind of correlation between the two. So the point being, the method of reading is itself radically interpretive. So whether you're misreading it, I'm making it. I use that. Maybe I'm using it wrong with the Isesaki quote. The reading it is misreading it or reading it correctly. Is what is correct is the point. You're just reading it and you're interpreting it, and it's the nature of that interpretation which you're yourself interrogating in terms of its usefulness to your endeavor. Because at some point you're looking at the result of that, the manifestation of that, right? That reading. Meaning correct and incorrect are equal, I guess, is what we're saying.
Couple of quick questions. That was a fantastic talk. Thanks very much for that. I remember from growing up in America that Northeast has some fantastic red sandstones, great limestone, etc. Country, lovely bricks in the south of America. The older I get, the more experience I get as an architect, the more seduced I am by the materials out there. I kind of had to wonder what your attitude is towards material, because it's quite a strong material kind of current in this wonderful work. And the other kind of quick question was, we saw some quite interesting kind of gestural drawing we did during the talk, drifting around the slides. I wonder what use of hand sketching is in your design process.
That's just a pointer. Instead of using it, it's active. Actually, I'm fairly generic in materials. Concrete, metal, raw wood, no color, very seldom color. I kind of stay away from it, and not interested in the latest. Incredibly generic. It's not a territory that I've spent much time on, and I've been aware of that. And I'm comfortable with a very simple palette, and that my focus is on what I'm talking about, and I don't feel I need to ramp it up. And it's actually a conservative. It's a conserving influence. I'm a very confused person. I mean, I'm actually interested in buildings that endure, which is an insanely old-fashioned idea. I'm actually interested in durability. Durability in the cultural sense, not pragmatically. That buildings, that in 100 years from now, that the building will in fact still have integrity. That's really, really, I mean, dates me. It should be 100 years old or something. And so, to me, like there's concrete used and they do really crappy concrete in China, and it's board form, and I should have done board form, but I got stuck. And it was purposeful. Like when you walk through it, you might think of Chandigarh. I just went to Chandigarh to remind myself, and I was going, I'm interested in this guy because it's so brutal. It's so unlikable. Last night, a person asked about are your spaces friendly? And I said, friendly. I was a totally loaded question, right? Not for you, obviously. No, but there's something that I'm still intrigued, and I got a very probably nostalgic, somewhat antiquated notion of modernism as having a certain kind of toughness, a conceptual toughness. And with something like Chandigarh, I took my two sons there for the first time last year, and my little one is 21 years old. And he left, and the next day we were talking, and he said, Dad, pure concept, nothing between, pure idea, just so in your face. There's nothing that you can appreciate at any other level than this big idea, right? You can't get around it. There's no escaping it. And that's intriguing to me. And there's so little of that in our world. It's so, again, when we talked a little bit about contingency. Contingency finally kind of takes over, and you're desperately trying to find your work by the time they either take the two big ideas out, or they take 1,000 little ideas. There's the two different ways they can go about it. And it's just hard to find finally that integrity, or find a voice. Really, that's all part of what we're talking about, is talking about the nature of the voice, right? And I knew you were going to do that when I say that. Hey, wait a minute, but no. But there can be a middle ground, that it can be a much more collective voice. I like Robert Altman, and I'd be much closer to Altman than I would be to Fellini, although again, I'm going to be kind of in between a little bit, and Altman just, Altman, because he just lets it, he's fabulous. He invites extremely good actors, and he was famous for, everybody likes working for him, and they come, they do cameos for nothing. Really famous actors, right? And he gets tons of them. And he just lets them go with the minimal stuff. Although even Woody Allen, Woody Allen never gives anybody the script. You only know your part. Really, really incredible. Think about that in architecture. It's also interesting. Like we were talking about that. On this one here, we talked about putting one person per system. And they have to work together, but you don't give them the script. They can only operate with their system and let them go. I'm going to do that. Use the model and see what happens out of that, again, the randomness. But I think you have to just experiment a little bit. But the ad hocness of Robert Altman is, everybody knows a Robert Altman movie, and in fact has its own odd coherence, which is kind of a lack of coherence in a way. Like you're saying, it's a different meaning. I think, are we okay?
We're okay, Thom.
I think so.
Very much.
My pleasure.
We'll see you very soon again. Thank you. That's great.